the last question I've got here, which I just thought, because could spice things up. This is question 40. The last question that was sent in is to Judith, but I'd like it for all of us to think about this. Judith, you spoke in a recent lecture about a mandate and the need for a mandate in relation to the vaccine. If the mandate is for the necessary structural changes in order to remedy harms carried out against bodies that matter, is it possible that this mandate could not be a vaccine mandate? Isn't it to practice population-level bio or necropolitics with vaccines exactly to say that there are bodies that do not matter to us, i.e. those bodies and lives which may be destroyed by a vaccine mandate? And I wanted to just see where we are with that, because it's interesting, because it says a culture war, and in terms of social division and inflammation of social division, here we are in whatever stage of the pandemic this turns out to be, with a very strange situation where legislation is being proposed in countries like Germany with regard to the unvaccinated, and this does raise issues around, I don't know, who counts, who doesn't count, who's in, who's out, what one is free to do and not to do. I wondered whether we thought any of these issues, identity politics and culture wars, we could think about that through the lens of the pandemic, debates around vaccines and mandates and such like. Anything come to mind?
Well, I have to say that I don't remember using the word mandate, so I don't know in what context I apparently used it.
I don't have a footnote for that.
Oh, okay,
No.
because that would help me respond more thoughtfully to the question. I understand that on the left and the right, and perhaps in the spectrum between, that there are many people who worry that the health crisis is augmenting state powers, and in particular forms of state surveillance.
Like Agamben.
Yes, and also the circumscription of personal liberties. But I also, on the other hand, I think that this is a chance for us to rethink our commitment to individualism as part of the spirit of capitalism, and that it's when I wear a mask in a situation where I'm bound to be close to other people, I'm not just protecting my life or even expressing my personal choice. I'm also indicating that I'm bound to the person I am near, and that person could be an utter stranger, that my life is tied to that life, and in some sense the mask gives a kind of provisional material form to that social bond. So I'm obligated to care for others, and I would hope that they would care for me, even if we don't know each other's names or don't speak each other's language, precisely because our bodies are such, and the way in which we live together, we are constantly taking in bits of each other. We share the air, we share surfaces, we sometimes share food. It's a Lucretian problem of bits of the other getting into me and bits of me getting into the other. I mean, in a way, we are constantly ingesting other people's worlds, and they are ingesting ours. And that's part of what it is to be a body in the world. We're not just these closed entities. We have a lot of porosity.
Yeah.
And each angle of porosity is a social relation. So when I talk about vulnerability, is not just my personal attribute or my individual condition, but my relation to others, or my relation to infrastructure, or my relation to the environment. Something about who I am and the relations that sustain me and that ought to sustain me and you is being articulated in that way. So I am hoping that we can, from this pandemic, elaborate a deeper sense of interdependency. Dr. King talked about that as a crucial dimension. Robin Kelly talks about that. I'm hoping that we can have a way of rethinking our embodied sociality, if I may speak that way,
Yeah.
and the ways in which our lives are implicated in each other's lives. So I do want governments to embrace that principle and to represent that principle, but I also understand the other position that if this state of exception increases the powers of the state to survey, to regulate, to invade lives, we're in trouble. But I want a different kind of government. You know, I'm not against government. I'm still in favor of good government and good health care, right? Affordable health care, right? Accessible health care. I'm a left liberal in this way. I'm not. I don't want to call down all government services because I'm afraid of terrifying forms of state sovereignty. I want to struggle to separate those things, and that's what I think a responsible democratic socialism can do.
Mm-hmm.
So
I
that's
think
where I
there's
stand.
always a tension between civic virtue and personal liberty, and that tension will always be there. The question is whether it is going to be creative or destructive. I tend to have a tilt toward personal liberty because I'm always concerned about the rights of the dissenting voices. And I come from a people who've been incarcerated, assassinated, marginalized when the voices are raised in the name of white supremacist civic virtue, you see. And yet civic virtue is crucial. But when you have such a weak and feeble civic soulcraft, and so personal liberty becomes licentiousness, selfishness, I don't care about public life, I don't care about common good, I just care about myself, then you got something else going on. And the question becomes, through the use of practical wisdom and phronesis, how do you stay on the tightrope with the best of civic virtues and the best of personal liberties such that public health is addressed, and yet people don't feel coerced and forced. You see, the coercive civic virtue is an oxymoron in a certain sense. And even the founding fathers at their best, the Madisons and others, and I have strong critiques of Madison, but they were wrestling with this tension within a very truncated American democracy. And so...
but isn't the point to cultivate, I mean, you talk about soulcraft, which is beautiful, but to cultivate an ethos of care.
Absolutely.
Right? And that goes beyond the family, goes beyond the local community, the local religion. Like, I'm not just looking out for my own, I'm looking out for people I don't know, and people I don't know are looking out for me. And I think that we need to build that ethos somehow, precisely so that a simple request like, you know, acting in such a way that you do not imperil the life of another human does not feel like coercion, but feels like a love of life,
way of being
a way of being together,
world,
a way of being in the world, a way of expanding
and
care
that's where
networks.
civic education is supposed to play a role, right? The cultivation of critical sensibility and the maturation of a loving soul, caring, concerned about others. I mean, my beloved wife, Anahita, you know, she has a deep suspicion of mandate. She comes from Iran.
Yeah.
They got all kind of mandates in that fascist state. All kind of mandates, sliding down slippery slopes, keeping track of people and so forth and so on. So I understand the source of her suspicion. I've got similar suspicion in terms of coming from a country that was democratic, but enslaved and Jim Crowed and James Crowed and lynched and terrorized and traumatized up until George Floyd, up until the present moment. So that kind of libertarian impulse, balanced with the civic virtue, balanced with the kind of, you know, rich social democratic socialists, even council communists of Gorder and Bannock and Rosa Luxemburg, Soviets without Bolsheviks, workers' organizations. That's part of my tradition too, you see. That's what makes me a little different than Brother Bernie. Bernie's still kind of New Deal, liberal, social democratic. That's revolutionary in America, we know that. But in terms of the larger spectrum, we want workers' organizations with the rights and the liberties with democratic forms across the board.
Glenn Greenwald, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I think COVID is a great way to end the conversation because I think it's going to be the defining event of our time, comparable probably to the 9/11 attack in terms of at least political and cultural debates in the West, in the United States, and in the Western part of the world. for me, 9/11 was my entry point into politics. And the framework that caused me to do that was a fear had emerged about a threat that was very real. And that fear was being exploited and, in my view, exaggerated on purpose in order to vest further power in the hands of the state and to place the population in greater levels of fear in order to breed an acquiescence or a conformity, an inability to question the state, which had postured itself as the protective wall that was going to keep us all safe from this threat. And I see COVID and the pattern of COVID in a very similar way, in that, Judith referenced this, and I think it's worth emphasizing that the power to do things like order people to stay in their homes and to shut down businesses and to quarantine and to close borders, these are incredibly dangerous powers. They prevent citizens from organizing with one another to protest people in power, to go out on the streets and organize. They prevent people from engaging in the most basic movement. And the fact that almost 2 years later, we're still accepting these kinds of extraordinarily draconian powers, even with the arrival of a vaccine that is essentially safe and effective, is alarming to me, as is the intolerance of dissent that has become part of this fabric, whereby even though health authorities have been repeatedly wrong about things, in March of 2020, if you went onto YouTube and encouraged people to wear masks, you would have been in contravention to the consensus of health authorities, the World Health Organization, Dr. Fauci, who were saying masks are not only unnecessary, but potentially dangerous. And this kind of framework emerged that no questioning of scientific consensus or the consensus of authorities was permissible. People were removed from social media platforms if they questioned the origins of COVID, even though there's now an open debate about it. And those kind of things are alarming to me. The fact that a population over 2 years has been trained to never question the pronouncements of authorities that are often wrong, to accept the assertion of draconian powers, even if well-intentioned, without sometimes asking whether these powers are excessive. And I think the vision that Judith drew is one I really am genuinely inspired by, the idea that we all need to overcome our sense that we're all kind of individualized, that we don't care for one another, that we have no responsibility to anybody else. But as Cornel said, I find it very difficult to see how that vision can be fulfilled by threatening and coercing and forcing people upon pain of losing their jobs in the middle of a pandemic if they don't comply with what they're told to do. That doesn't seem like it's going to foster social cohesion to me, or the idea that we're all in this together. I think it's going to kind of do the opposite. It's going to breed mistrust on the part of institutions, that if they're trying to tell me that I don't have the right to choose for myself what things I put into my body or my children's body, I think it's going to breed a lot of resentment. And I worry that instead of trying to use persuasion, trying to use an appeal to people's common humanity to restore trust in our common fate, where we all are tied together, that there's kind of a punitive strain that has emerged, whereby we're telling people, we don't know how effective cloth masks are, but if you don't wear them, you're going to be banned from all sorts of involvement in public life. Even though I'm vaccinated and protected, I still demand that you do, to the point where I want you to lose your job if you're not yet convinced that it's safe for you and your children and you don't obey. And I'm concerned about some of the enduring political, cultural, and social outcomes from the way in which the pandemic has been discussed and managed, and it's centralized power even more in the biggest corporations. Amazon, Facebook, Google have all gotten much wealthier, much more powerful. Small businesses have gone out of business because of lockdowns, and governments around the world have much greater power in their hands too, to censor and to keep citizens locked down or quarantined and in obedience. And I definitely worry about the long-term implications of that, while obviously acknowledging that COVID is a serious health crisis.
It's interesting. I think maybe we do have a disagreement. I'm a little bit more skeptical of personal liberty these days. I think I was always on the side of personal liberty. I'm not so sure what the personhood of personal liberty is, and if that's a form of individualism that actually is governed by a kind of death drive. You know, Glenn, you're in Brazil, and as you know, Bolsonaro has been accused in the International Criminal Court, if I'm not mistaken, of crimes against humanity because he has failed to implement health policies that would have saved many people's lives. And the lives that are gone are very often lives of people who have been living in tentative shelters or who are poor and don't have the same kinds of protections as others who are more safely housed. I think that we have to look at people like Trump or Bolsonaro as appealing to this sense of personal liberty. Like, I don't have to do anything to save anyone else. I don't have to change anything about my life. I refuse all regulations in the name of my personal liberty because that's my personhood and that's my individualism, and it encourages a form of egoism that doesn't recognize the deep ways in which we're connected to each other. And either we're going to recognize those ways and save some lives, or we're going to fail to recognize those ways and go down killing or dying with the flag of personal liberty.
Yeah.
It's like, I think we've got a death drive issue that uses the idea of personal liberty. Like, you know, people who are just, you know, they don't care. I'm not vaxxed. I don't wear a mask. I'm up against you. I'm near you on the subway. You die. I don't care because I'm expressing my civil liberty. Now, I think as well that we have to ask who is dying, right? In the US, we see it's black and brown people at very high rates. It's the elderly. It's people who are most vulnerable, people who are unhoused. We could say, I don't want to obey a mandate or for there to be a mandate because I want my personal freedom, my ability to work. I understand that. But if your personal freedom and your ability to work comes at the expense of other people's lives, then you have a quandary, and we should be putting that quandary out front and center. Absolutely. Because of course it's good to have the freedom of movement. Of course we need to work, but of course we need to save lives. And my fear is when it's personal liberty versus the intensification of state powers and their surveillance mechanisms in particular, that we are no longer able to have that conversation, right? Put both values on the table.
But see, that's exactly what I mean by licentiousness in terms of the ways in which personal liberty language is mobilized for licentiousness.
Yes.
Because even John Stuart Mill, you got a harm principle.
Yes, you do have a harm principle.
There's no liberty without constraint.
Yeah.
There's no freedom without constraint.
Yes,
right?
but it's not
so
just
that. So there has to be some accountability.
Yeah.
If you're talking about impunity, the way Trump and the others talk about it, that has nothing to do with liberty.
I understand
That's
that.
just licentious.
Well,
Yes,
it's one thing for me to say I must constrain myself in order not to do harm, and then I am still here in the position of the individual calculating what's harm, what's not, and he taught us how to calculate.
Right.
But there might be an ethics that's beyond calculation. In other words, I'm thinking about my life, which means others are thinking about it in the same way, and we are linked in this living world, on this planet, right? Which is why the interdependency that we need to understand to fight COVID is also the interdependency we need to understand to fight climate destruction.
I agree.
And so we need I would call it a communist ontology, quite frankly.
It's a solidarity that's thicker than any conception of personal
I think
liberty.
we need a radical social ontology. We need to rethink selfhood, its boundaries, its openings, to have a completely different ethics and a politics of care. So I'm pushing against the personal liberty folk right now.
Yeah, no,
sorry, I know that's extreme.
Can I just interject one?
Yeah,
please.
Yeah.
Who is it that said that?
No, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Go on.
One point about Brazil that I find so interesting, and I I think it illustrates your point really well that in Brazil, you have Jair Bolsonaro, who, as you absolutely correctly explained, has been incredibly reckless at best in terms of the mismanagement of the COVID pandemic, clearly causing all kinds of deaths that were avoidable. And he has as well engaged in the discourse that vaccines for him are something he doesn't think he needs because he has natural immunity, has been encouraging people from the beginning to go out without masks and the like. And yet at the same time, in Brazil, there's almost no vaccine hesitancy that there is in the United States. It's something like 95, 97% of the adult population has been voluntarily going to get vaccinated. And the reason for that is because they have a faith and trust in the Brazilian healthcare system that goes all the way back to when Lula broke the patent on HIV medication, saying he refuses to watch people die of a preventable disease because they can't afford the medication. Brazil has made huge strides in vaccinating people and providing an amazingly robust public health service. And so instead of forcing people to go and do it, you've convinced them to trust the system that they have their best interest in mind. And so you have almost no vaccine hesitancy in Brazil, despite having a president telling them they shouldn't get the vaccine or don't need it. Whereas in the United States, a lot of the people who have been vaccine hesitant, some of them have been obviously conservatives who have bought into this, what you might want to call death wish, personal liberty if you want, but a lot of them as well have been overwhelmingly Black and brown communities, poor people who have come not to trust, health authorities. They remember experiments in the 20th century and the malicious intent behind them. And that's why I say, I think this vision of bringing us together is going to have to be about restoring people's faith and trust in the institutions we want them to listen to, instead of threatening and coercing them and forcing them to, upon pain of punishment, to obey. I think that's the much more kind of cohesive framework for getting people to think differently about the world.